Let me introduce myself. My name is Kurt Garrick, and I'm the coordinator of the Sustainable Buildings and Climate Initiative at the United Nations Environment Program. We are an initiative that is a joint venture between the public and private key stakeholders in the building sector, working to promote sustainable building policies and practices worldwide, and feeding into processes such as the UNFCCC climate change negotiations and the conferences on sustainable development. We have with us a pretty esteemed panel with a broad range of expertise. Starting closest to me on my right is Karine Tapau. Karine has more than 30 years experience in urban sustainability, urban development, and the built environment, working at various levels of local and global institutions in both public and private sectors. She is an architect by training, worked as an architect in Zurich and in Helsinki and in New York, including for Robert A.M. Stern. She served for 10 years as the chief executive of the Building Construction Department of Helsinki. And she served as the chair, or the former chair, she is the former chair, of both ICLEI, the Local Governments for Sustainability, and the Marrakesh Task Force on Sustainable Construction, Buildings and Construction, a UN process. Seated to her right is Marcelo Takeoka. Marcelo is the president of the Brazil Sustainable Construction Council. He is a civil engineer by training, earning his doctorate in 2009. He's a member of the Brazil National Committee for Technological Development of Housing in the National Secretary of Housing and Ministry of Cities. He is the chair of UNEP SBCI, and he's also a member of the Sao Paulo Climate Change and Eco-Economy Committee. Seated to his right is Krishna Duplessis, an associate professor at the University of Pretoria with specialties in urban resilience and regenerative development. She has been a longtime researcher of sustainability science, has applied to human settlements, has worked in the fields of urban sustainability, climate change. She studied architecture and obtained her PhD in urban sustainability from the University of Salford in the UK. She's the lead author of UNEP's Agenda 21 for Sustainable Construction for Developing Countries. Seated to her right is Dr. Chris Pike, who is the Vice President of Research for the United States Green Building Council. Prior to USGBC, he was National Director of Climate Change Services for CTG Energetics in California, and he had served in the Office of Research for the United States Environmental Protection Agency. So we have with us a pretty wide-ranging array of experience, very much relevant to the topics that we'll be discussing today. Already this morning, we've heard a lot about policies, applications, work in cities, work in developing countries. And over the next several days, we'll hear a lot about both technologies, best practices, as well as policies. What we hope this panel will do is lend its expertise into saying, how can we gather all of that, all of this discussion that's going on, and direct it towards a process, an international process that will really embed sustainable building policies and practices at the global level. There is a unique opportunity next June at the Rio+20 summit to really position the building sector at the forefront of overall sustainable development objectives. So I'd like to ask each of the panelists to talk a little bit first about their experiences and how they see Rio+20 as an opportunity, but also how we can position the building sector to really be an implementing agency or agent of overall sustainable development. So Karine, I was very brief in your CV. I could take up the entire session talking about your experience in sustainable development and at the international level. If you would talk a little bit about what you did with the Marrakesh Task Force and where you see sustainable buildings in the context of international dialogue going into Rio+20.
Thank you. Thank you, Kurt, for the long presentations, and thanks for inviting us here. I wanted to, because I'm a writer, and I like I like to think of the meaning of words. So why are we at a sustainable building conference and not at the green building conference or a building conference or whatever future nice building conference? The sustainability concept, of course, was introduced by Gro Harlem Brundtland in her report, which was the background report for the Rio, which we are now talking about, but the original Rio in 1992, for the conference that was called the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. And people tend to forget the D. They always think that it was just the environment conference. In that conference, they didn't talk so much about buildings. They talked a little bit about cities, which they actually called local authorities in that conference. But 10 years after Rio in Johannesburg, the conference was called the World Summit on Sustainable Development. And that's where the concept of sustainable consumption and production was highlighted more than earlier. And the Marrakesh process was established in particular to elaborate the concept of sustainable consumption and production and what it could mean. So in any case, it tried to bring in the systemic thinking and the process thinking, that wherever we stand, we are both consumers and we are also, many of us are also parts of production processes. And it was an innovative process in the sense that governments were encouraged to create task forces and take whatever topic they thought was crucial. And Finland decided that if you talk about sustainable consumption and production, you definitely have to also talk about buildings. And that's why we started talking about it at the end of the year 2005. And the task force was wrapped up last year, and inheritance was given to UNEP's SBCI, to your shoulders, Kurt. Because we were dealing with governments, that means that we were talking about policies, and not about best practices, but best policies. And it's very difficult to measure whether we achieved anything or not, but at least I think together with UNEP SBCI, we were successful in bringing the awareness to the agendas that buildings matter, and particularly in energy, in the energy perspective. And at this point, I'm wondering if we even overemphasized the point of energy. We certainly brought it up 2006, and I remember very well that people were surprised, say, why focus on such a narrow issue, and why energy, and so on. So in fact, there has been a huge change in thinking, that people now realize that buildings have a huge impact on energy consumption. Their production and their use has a huge impact on energy. But now going towards Rio+20 next June, I'm here reading from the paper that the United Nations has identified two main themes for the conference. And the one is a green economy within the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. And UNEP has written a thick background paper for it, which has chapters on cities and on buildings, but again, very much focusing on energy and resource efficiency, and not looking at maybe not looking at the whole sustainability picture. But the second big topic for the conference, and I'm reminding you all the time, it's an intergovernmental conference, the topic is an institutional framework for sustainable development. And that's where UNEP, I mean, one of the solutions would be that the UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, would be upgraded into a United Nations Environment organization, like we have the World Trade Organization or World Health Organization and so on. We'll see what the governments come up. But next to that, that's not the whole picture. I'm sorry. It's interesting also that the Secretary General of the conference is no small man. It's the Deputy Secretary General of the UN, and he comes from China. And he's definitely very, very, very close to the Chinese government. And which is also really important because until now, sustainable development has been considered sort of an industrialized country issue. And Mr. Shah Tsukang, who is the secretary, has listed 7 issues. And please bear with me, I want you to hear them all. First, green jobs and social inclusion. Second, energy access, efficiency and sustainability. Third is food security and sustainable agriculture. Sound water management. They all, if you think, they all have also land use dimensions. Management of the oceans. Improved resilience and disaster preparedness. And last but not least, sustainable cities, which includes transport, buildings, and energy systems. So this is also indicative of the change in thinking from individual environmental issues into whole systems and very much focus on the role of cities. As we know, half of the world's population now lives in urban areas. This is projected to rise to 60% by 2030, with almost all the urban growth occurring in low and middle income countries. There will be more megacities, but also smaller cities will take up much of the migration to cities. And that means that the urban agendas are changing. They are not new issues as such, but they are issues that are new on urban agendas, like migration. Today, there are 214 million international migrants. And in addition, of course, we have the national migrants in African countries, in India, in China, millions and hundreds of millions of people moving to cities. And that brings us to the issue that was earlier also highlighted here, the challenge of inclusive cities. Because it would be a mistake to think that top-down solutions and high technology would be the solution. But really, we need to find ways how to include people in solution. The solution is not to bring air conditioning to every home, but there are other kinds of challenges. And another challenge is that many cities have been hard hit by the recent financial crisis, not least because of its impact on real estate and the value of real estate as collateral. International real estate investments drive not only financial bubbles, but urban development bubbles. Buildings are measured in billions of dollars, not square meters. Investor appetite dictates what is worth building and where. And these are the office parks with green labels that we talk about. That's what the investor appetite is feeding. What next? Where do we go? We realize that sustainability is not a technological issue. It's not a rating issue. No amount of insulation will solve sustainable buildings challenges. It's not a political issue alone, but we cannot forget the power of politics. Researchers cannot solve it alone, not financing and investments alone, but we need them along. Not human behavior alone, but that's also important. Not buildings alone, but cities. There are not even cities alone, all of that. We all have to take several roles, push our governments, not fight against them, but challenge the industry also, challenge our mobility patterns, build new kind of infrastructure. We have to break the paths that make us path dependent. Incremental changes are not enough. We have to talk to our governments to make them understand, because don't forget the Rio+20 is primarily an intergovernmental conference. We have high expectations there. As Kurt, you said this morning, there might be another Copenhagen. If there are too high expectations, there may be a huge disappointment as well. That's why we have to be realistic, but I think we have to be much, 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 much more ambitious than what we have been until now, and talk with your governments and make them understand that it's urgent to act now and to get their support. Thank you.
Thank you, Karin. Marcelo, your country is hosting the 2012 Conference on Sustainable Development. How engaged is Brazil? And you have several different hats within your country, including promoting sustainable construction, where are you within the overall planning for Rio+20, and how can you help to position the building sector up front and center at Rio+20?
First of all, I believe that the building sector in the urban development, it's the most important issue for climate change, energy efficiency, and to have transport efficient. To talk about Rio+20, this conference, 20 years after the Rio+92, changed a lot because now we have UNFCCC for climate change negotiations, biodiversity, UNEP for negotiation biodiversity, and then Rio+20 can't overlap all the negotiations already UNEP are doing over biodiversity, climate change, etc., for sustainable development. Then the main issue for Rio+20 is green economy. Let's explain what is green economy. Green economy is what we make good for the planet, and we can save money, and you can improve efficiency of nations and cities and buildings. And for that, the construction sector is the most important sector for green economy, to create green jobs. And this is the main theme for Rio+20. But I think the great challenge is that most of people of the construction sector do not interact very well with the financial system. And both construction sector and financial system are very conservative. They don't want to change. And all opportunity I have to talk with the bank directors, I talk to them, why do you think the buildings are now on construction? It's ordinary ones or common ones, or is more sustainable ones? And the answer is ordinary ones. Most of them is ordinary ones like the 20th century. And how long you give the financial for these buildings? Oh, I give the financial for 20 to 30 years. And how you think the construction sector will be in 10 to 20 years or 15 years? Oh, it will change a lot for more sustainable ones. And I said to them, then you have a problem, because if the construction sector will change in 10 years and you make financial for 30 years, you have 20 years with problem, because the old ones will lost value and lost guarantees. And he looked to me, I never thinking about that. I think we needed to change something. No? This is a little overview of the Rio+20. I would like to show the economist of this week. Nowhere to hide, investing during a time crisis. This is very interesting because I was talking to Karen just a few minutes ago. We can predict where we are in 1 month, 2 months, 1 year, maybe. And we can predict where we are in 2050. But we can't predict where will happen in between, because we are changing. In the future, our planet will be more sustainable. I don't have any doubt for that. But we are in a moment of changing. And people are people in the construction sector are like the financial system, nowhere to hide, where to invest money, where to make buildings, how to make new buildings, what the society wants in the future. And is this.
Krishna, you have a unique perspective because you work in developing countries often, primarily. And most of what we've talked about here, we say there is a great need and a great emphasis that needs to be placed on application in developing countries. A, how do you do that? And B, is the timeline so long, is the horizon so far out that we're really not building in effectiveness? Are we going to be too late to really solve some of those problems?
Well, tricky questions. I had a moment of deja vu this morning when Alfred Ngouwe stood up and he made his presentation. And I remember similar keynotes I made in 2000 in Maastricht, in 2002 in Oslo, saying more or less the same things about going back and say, well, what do the people on the ground want? Looking at indigenous knowledge systems, looking at traditional ways of doing it. And I've since changed my mind around all of that. Because the reality is that when you're working in developing countries, they don't want to go back there. They've got people on the ground have different aspirations. And it's how one deals with those aspirations. And I think where the time lag comes in is the enormous aspirations on the one side and the promises being made by politicians around meeting those aspirations. And the reality that there is no way in hell that we are going to be able to give people those aspirations. And how do we start changing the aspirations and the promises to something that is more realistic? And I think part of that lies in understanding the context that you work in. And most of the urban growth, I mean, Africa is at this point one of the most rapidly urbanizing continent. Okay, from a very small base, and most people in Africa are not used to living in cities. As we heard this morning, even people who are living in Finland have to relearn why you need to do maintenance on your house. And the situation is even worse when you have no cultural heritage of living in an urban context. But people are moving towards the cities, and most of the urban growth in Africa is informal settlement. It's slums, and there is a concentration of poverty that you're not going to break very easily because there is no way of distributing the wealth the way that the economies work at this moment, and both the national economies as well as the international economy. And because your national economies are tied within your international economic system, getting that wealth within a country like Nigeria, for example, back into the country and out of the various Swiss bank accounts, where it has been stashed for many generations, and that's the same thing in many of these African countries, is going to be impossible. So you're sitting in a situation where you have vast numbers of people coming into an urban context, living in ways for which their tradition has not prepared them. There is no way, when you're living in a slum settlement, of actually doing some subsistence farming, doing some subsistence agriculture even to keep you going, dealing with your own waste management issues. How do you go about that? But that is what will have to happen, is to go back and say, well, we need to understand that these people are not a nuisance. They are actually a wonderful source and a great opportunity. And how do we use that energy so that they can start helping themselves to create more livable settlements? And if you then look back at European history, and we look at all these wonderful cities, and it's difficult to imagine that at one stage most of European cities also had similar situations. We had rich people concentrating in one area, and the poor people living in hovels, and eventually start building up and you get a city. How do we fast track that system? Because we don't now have 200 or 300 years for that kind of gentrification to happen. It needs to happen a lot faster. So how do we start structuring the way that wealth is put into these communities in a way that will actually help them to develop things? Because you said we tend to look at the slum communities of Africa and we think, well, this is poverty. But it's a relative poverty, it's a cash poverty. It's not a poverty in terms of human capital or in terms of social capital. What we need to find is the way of unleashing that implicit capital that sits in the energy and the willingness and the abilities of people. And then to start looking at things at that particular scale. And I think one of the things we need to do is to start looking at the models that nature gives us. Ray talked this morning about the shift in where we are thinking with sustainability, and I think that's very much what we're now seeing is with the first Rio is we had this wonderful utopian ideals of how we want the world to work. And the reality is now starting to bite, and we need to start working in ways of sustainability that's aligned with how the world really works. And if we start looking at metaphors of ecosystems and the granularity that sits within ecosystems and how you have different functions and response diversities that sits within an ecosystem. And you can start transferring that to cities and the metaphors to cities and how people sit within cities and say, well, there's different responses, there's different ways of meeting the same objective. And not just the ones that sits in all these wonderful checklists about what is a sustainable city, but how people within that system starts evolving and developing their own niches, and how do we encourage that kind of internal growth and development.
Okay. I want to take an opportunity to welcome our internet audience. This is being webcast, and we have kind of a follow-up question, which I think is appropriate for you to answer at this point. How should we prepare people to live in an urban life in the city? We've talked a lot about buildings and building the cities and the buildings themselves. How do we prepare the people?
Me?
Yes.
Oh, goodness. Good question. I don't think you can actually prepare anybody for living in an urban way, because the way that we live in our cities keep on changing as well. If we think about how people in Europe live in cities and how people in Africa and how people in North America live in cities, it's actually quite different ways of engaging with the city. But how you prepare people, you probably will have to go back to at a school level. And have this as part of a life-orientating scheme. Or it is about leading by example, bringing in programs that deals with it. And it's a touchy subject. I remember at the, in 2000, there was this, the Hanover World Expo had a Global Cities Conference. And the then Minister of the Environment in Mozambique stood up and he says, you don't understand, I have to teach people in my country how to use a flush toilet. And people were extremely upset that he could say that, because it was seen as a negative thing and as it's politically incorrect. How dare you say that people don't know how to use flush toilets? But it's a reality on the ground. And it's a reality that can only go in through programs where people are actually taught how to look after their built environment, how to use modern technologies, how to not just how to build their own houses, but how to maintain and how to engage in civil life, because we are also dealing with a whole different structure where you may have had in Africa traditional tribal leadership structures and tribal systems. Now suddenly you are sitting in an urban context with a different political system, and the only way that one can do that is maybe to go in and engage at a grassroots level in terms of these programs, but to do that in a way that doesn't come over as arrogant or as politically incorrect is going to be really, really tricky. And maybe the only way to do that is from communities themselves.
Okay. Karine, you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to say exactly where you actually ended that I think you don't educate people, but you invite them to co-create the city. And I think that what I've been reading about the development of big cities in poor countries, it's really the wisdom is at the grassroots, as we are used to saying, and we are far too used to thinking that we can give the solutions from above. That's why we bring wrong solutions. So for the minister, that was politically incorrect, but maybe it was also politically incorrect to think that the flush toilet would be the only solution. Yes. So that we really, it's a huge rethinking that's necessary, and we actually, it's also a global challenge. I'm involved in the city of Helsinki in a democracy group, figuring out in which ways people would be more involved in developing their own city.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to the engagement and vision through the Local 21, Agenda 21 process. But Marcelo, quick comment?
Yes. I would like one comment in another perspective to live in cities. In Brazil, Nowadays, we have 84% of our population in the city. 84. And looking for the crisis on the year 30s, 1930, most of the population lives on rural areas. Nowadays, most of the population lives on cities. And this is much more difficult to mitigate and adaptate the citizens for economic change, climate change, etc., etc., etc. Now we have a much more challenge to improve security to live in cities. When we change the climate, we change the economy, because in 30 years, the people go to the farm, take some fruits, and have food to live, have a place to live. Nowadays, it's much more difficult. This is another perspective that we need to pay attention to this.
Chris, the U.S. Green Building Council has been very effective in promoting green building through its LEED rating system. In the context of some of the issues that we've discussed already here today in terms of meeting social needs, meeting poverty, wealth creation, what are the limitations of LEED, and how can LEED actually address some of those? Or is it really only about the buildings and the building components?
Let me answer by stepping it up just a little bit and offer, just step back the discussion, because let me basically say that the dialogue we're having on the panel really reflects this strong and intensifying sort of bimodal distribution of issues. We have the issues of Finland, or of New York City, or of Shanghai, and then we have these issues of that we were just talking about so directly. And let me just step back into this, and I'll get to your question directly. But I think as a milestone from Rio to Rio, if you look at say the COP process, and those of us who were in say Copenhagen as a milestone, and try to rub together two people who really cared about buildings, or find them in the mess of COP 15, at least back in Copenhagen, and it would have been a lonely thing, right? We looked around and we said, where are buildings? Where is the where is the building in the development part? Where are our cities and so forth? And it was pretty lonely. And then you think, as a geographer, I look at that problem and I basically say, look at I view partially as an information problem as well. If you look at the issue of these built environments, our buildings, our homes, our communities, are the spaces where we spend 90% of our lives. Yet you look down on them with the types of information that go into our decision making, and we're lucky if the little pixel on the map says urban. And it doesn't matter if it's a slum, a suburb, or Trump Tower, it is urban. And that, if you look down on Manhattan or down on Shanghai, you are looking at less than 20% of the spaces people actually occupy. And so there is a profound, right from the top, vacuum of information about the nature of these urban environments. And for me, that's really sad, because I look at this as these built environments as the nexus of the things we were talking about. We have the energy for what? To power the buildings, the transport, the supply chain. Transportation to what? Between buildings. Buildings for what? For people. And what is the role of people? They decide on how those things are put together. And so from my perspective, so kind of where we're going, just to speak first to the Rio+20 issue, and then I'll come back to your specific question on USGBC's role. So our role for Rio+20 is working with the Green Building Council of Brazil and other partners to advocate for the role of public-private partnership in the discussion, to advocate for the green economy as a general construct, and through the lens of urban sustainability generally. And to do that, we've really focused on emphasizing high-performance neighborhoods and communities, to the point that was made in the opening plenaries, really focusing on that scale of engagement. And then within that, focusing on housing and schools as two action items, because frankly, if we can't agree on something like schools and housing for folks, we really have trouble getting further than that. And our interest in those is really motivated by those outcomes of promoting the green economy, alleviating poverty, focusing on human health benefits and then secondarily into the energy, carbon, climate, and resource issue. And then echoing what's been said before, the issues of promoting resilience, the idea that these kinds of development are more resilient socially, demographically, and environmentally to these endogenous and exogenous stressors. So that's kind of our template for the Rio+20. Those are the things that we hope not to have that repeat of, say, the COP process, and to bring it in a more substantial. So speaking to your direct question, I think that there's a couple of things. One of the ways I answer your question about the role of, say, LEAD in particular, I think that there's no, although there's often a temptation, there's no efficacy in thinking about LEAD in isolation. LEAD is is embedded within a construct for achieving market transformation. In my mind, LEAD is less an assessment tool than a device for market transformation. And the question in every circumstance is, what market are you trying to transform? What scale of effect are you looking for? Is it a community, a neighborhood, a building, an interior space? And then to me, the question is, what are the processes that maintain the current situation? If we don't understand those processes, we cannot intervene, whether we're government and or market. And then what is that future state we aspire to? And so to me, the limitation of a device is in looking at it too narrowly, which is, I think, an extension of what we heard this morning. And I think there is a limitation, and just like I'll wind this down, but I think that this issue of saying, if we don't sufficiently understand those processes that create the current distribution of practice, we can't intervene. It's not simply enough to have the aspirational goal. We have to have the goal and the understanding of process that we're trying to intervene in. And so I'm real happy to elaborate on that, but that's maybe some thoughts to get us started.
Okay. I want to go back to the question about the aspirations and the long time horizon that are built into all of the discussions. We talk about 2030, 2040, 2050. Many of us will be retired by then, and it'll be somebody else's issue. How do we advance the timeline? How do we actually make progress faster to address some of the issues and using the building sector as a vehicle to do so? Krishna.
I think if we look at why things take so long to change, it sits in certain lock-ins in the system. And those lock-ins sits within individual choices. And I know it's a strange thing to say, because you say, well, you look at the COP process and what is happening there, and it's these countries standing off against each other and sort of sitting trapped in an argument about the right to commit suicide in your own way. But within all of that, there's individuals sitting there making those decisions. And it's the politicians who say, well, if I don't do this in this particular way, or I don't support this particular thing, I might not get re-elected. There's the businessman who says, well, if I don't do it in this way, I'm not going to achieve value for my stockholders, not my stakeholders, my stockholders. And I may not get, I might be fired from my job. And you go through each of these, you have the public who sit there and say, well, we have certain rights and we have certain aspirations, and we all want, I've been eyeing the little iPads that's been floating all over and thinking, that's quite nice. And that's a natural human thing. And until we as humans come to the point where we realize that we're a little bit like alcoholics, and we don't admit that we are alcoholics, that we are addicted to this particular way of engaging with the world, I don't think we are going to get to a fast-track process, because that is what's keeping us in place. So what we actually do need is maybe a larger wake-up call, and that's probably what's going to come. And if you look at ecosystems and how change happens in ecosystems where you have very strong lock-in, where your resources are tied down very straight into so almost monocultures that's taken over. Eventually that system breaks open, and that allows fast and really, really rapid change to happen. And perhaps that is what we need, is to have that kind of a rapid breakdown of the system. And by looking at things like The Economist, it looks like the global economy is almost ready for breaking that up, and that's probably the only way we can go ahead.
But what you seem to be talking about is fundamentally changing not only the way we go around building, but people's fundamental patterns of consumption and production. Karine, you have experience with this as part of the SCP task force, specifically on buildings. how easy will it be to change people's patterns of consumption and production, recognizing that everyone wants the bigger thing, more things, and how does it relate to the advancements that we make incrementally just being wasted by continued consumption patterns?
I think definitely, but with the solutions in our urban environment and in buildings, you can change the path. So because we are very path dependent, and we are dependent on what is given us as the machine that we are using. So if we don't offer public transport, people of course will take their car if they can afford it. Or if people are not offered sustainable buildings to live in, then they will have their 2 cars and their green house somewhere in the suburbs. So in that sense, there's the responsibility that starts from regional planning and from metropolitan level planning and goes down to building control, where I used to be. But on the other hand, the more I've been looking at these issues, I think that we have to look, and I'm now repeating a bit what has been said here, we have to look more and more also on the non-market solutions. And it's not the public-private partnerships that are going to solve this, but really more and more getting rid of this market dependency. Like we said, that looking for people's own solutions. Like, let's say, one part of the financialization and the investor dependency was the real estate market that I was referring to briefly, that produces these office parks and shopping malls where you need your private car. But on the other hand, also basic public services, municipal services, are more and more delivered by multinational companies. The services that used to be taken care of by people themselves, with waste management and local energy production, local water communities, and so on. So I think that's also one point where we have to look at more sustainable solutions, that they don't necessarily come from the market, they come from people's own solutions.
Chris, do you want to address consumption patterns in the U.S.?
I'd love to. I try to every day.
It's not politically correct. It's a word you cannot say in the U.S.
Oh, I don't think that's true at all. I don't think that's true. I think that although at this moment you have a demand-side recession, so that consumption is a problem in that sense. But what I would say is that at least to take that question back, I think that one of the issues is I think one of the challenges with the scale of effect that we are looking for, in the sense, like as we heard the folks in the plenary talk about today, we seek to change the communities at a whole scale. But I think that there's a bit of there is clearly a disconnect, because by and large, as was said earlier, there's a very limited span of control for decision making at a community scale. A community is emergent. Like, in the sense, with notable exceptions, we don't make, we don't decide what it's going to look like. It emerges from the assembly rules down at the bottom. And for me, the question is not market, non-market, public versus whatever. The question is, what are the assembly rules that we are giving, that are determining how that emergent phenomenon we call a community comes into being? What are we asking? What kinds of incentives are we creating? What kind of rules? What is the sandbox? And I don't think we can rush to say, boy, we don't like the outcome at the scale of communities, thus we're going to get ever madder about it. I think, because that doesn't, to me, I feel like there's a level of going, we're going to disregard that, we're going to step away from the building, that's so yesterday. Well, no, actually, the cities and communities of the future will still be built of decisions at those finer scales. The question is, how are we changing the aspirations for those, and how are we changing the terms that those decisions will be made under? And so for me, the market's a tool, government's a tool, their interaction with them is a tool. And so I don't think there's anything particularly distinctive in the US about those dynamics, except for, the reality in the US is there is no acceptance. A lot of the trends we heard about earlier in terms of our antithesis to the government, lack of trust about the government, lack of trust about centralization, mean that we need to use different ratios of the tools for market versus public because of philosophical concerns about government and technological leadership. It's a whole, we need beer or wine for that conversation.
After Rio, the local Agenda 21 process was set up whereby it tried to engage local communities to develop sustainability plans. I think about 10 years after that, there was a survey, it may have been done by ICLEI, that surveyed local authorities, and they thought they didn't really have much influence or an impact. Much of the discussion today and leading up to Rio+20 has been about local authorities and cities really being the agents of change. That the most impact that you can make is at the city level. How do you see that really leading up into Rio+20? And is there a change that we need to make in terms of the scale of actions rather than a large global action that we might expect out of, say, COP15 in Copenhagen or Rio+20? Is it a series of smaller scale actions at city levels that will really make the difference? Marcelo?
Oh, it's difficult to answer, but I think the city, the mayor is more proxy of the citizens. Then it's a more better way to influence people to change. But people don't like to change. Almost people don't like to change. I think we need to give another view for this point. I would like to start with the happiness index. I like very much this idea because what happens in the 20th century? 20th century, we improve a lot of propaganda ads and market sales to people buy something that they don't want to do, but they buy because the other people buy. One of the aspects of the human beings is the comparison. If your neighbor have a new car, you want to have a new one. Since your car is good. But I changed because my neighbor changed my car. Then I think the world will change in this way. And about politicians or public policies on city level, on state level, on national level, we have a great problem because it's just for 4 years or 5 years maximum, and then change everything. Then people don't look for long term. The people look for short term. This is a great challenge for us, mainly in democracy countries. I am not against democracy. I like democracy. It's very good. It's democratic. The people could choose your governor, mayor, etc. But sometimes this is not working. Maybe in England they have the large chambers because it's lifetime, and this kind of people could make some changes looking for long term. We need to have something like this to talk about this.
Okay. I think what you're saying is that some of these sustainability objectives are clearly long-term objectives.
Yes.
But mayors and local officials are often elected with short-term mandates and short-term political careers in some cases. Karine, you wanted to follow up, and then there's a webcast question up on the screen as a follow-up, and I'll let you address that as well. What is the most important action to get impacts fast in the city level?
Let me first, two comments. Non-market is not public. They're two different things. Non-market, think of it. And second, US diplomats absolutely consequently refuse the word to use the use of the word unsustainable consumption at the UN, believe me. But to come back to cities, that's where the action becomes real, because at the national level, it's more or less papers, decisions, politics, I mean, even if they're good and necessary. But at the city level, it really becomes hands-on work. Sustainable mobility, sustainable land use, sustainable procurement, public procurement, sustainable building ordinances, sustainable water management, energy production, they are all decisions that can be made at the municipal level. And good mayors do get re-elected. That we have also seen that kind of miracles. So I think, Marcelo, you're far too pessimistic, and I understand because you're coming from Brazil, but you have great examples in Brazil, also, of course, in Curitiba and so on.
Yes, yes.
So really, in case there are boring lectures, I took a book with me, Welcome to the Urban Revolution by Jeb Brugman, and he actually talks about the city. It's a whole network. It's a network of cities that actually covers the whole world if you look at it from the outer universe. So it's really, if we don't solve sustainable cities challenges, we don't solve any sustainability challenges at all.
Chris?
I want to come back to this whole issue of scale, and it links up to the top question. As we've now moved and said, well, we've moved from buildings up to cities. And what we forget is that the world operates in nested hierarchies. And if in your smaller scale hierarchies, change happens fast. If you start looking at larger scale hierarchies, which is a city, change happens slowly. So to ask, how do we going to get impacts fast happening in the city, it's like asking how do we get the glacier to move faster. Well, maybe heat up a little bit, and that might do, and that put some heat on the city and things might change. But at that level of the scale, things do not happen fast, which is why we're taking so long at an international level to get change. Where fast change happens is at the bottom level, in your smaller scale things. And how things start happening at that level, building up to create emergence within the larger system. And it links back to what you've been talking about, the assembly rules of society, of how we assemble our cities. And part of that lies in how we decide what we build, where we build, why we build. And how we then as a neighborhood start interacting. So it's taking up the level from just my own building, then linking a little bit and get that consciousness about what happens at a neighborhood level. And that's how cities are created. They're created by individual decisions, by property developers, by bankers who decide whether they're going to lend money or not, by individuals who say, well, this is the kind of place that I want to live in. And that is where you're actually going to get the change happening that goes up back to the top level. How we harness that there's a number of methods that we've started to talk about. It's things like market transformation, making choices available, making finances available, and applying heat and pressure to get that change is happening. And sometimes do that through legislation, regulation. And I can see now suddenly there's before Rio and before in South Africa, before COP, there's this flurry of green building regulations that's now going in from a city level saying, well, this is what we're going to do. So it is getting a little bit of that external spotlight. And I think in all of that, our biggest weapon is something that we tend to forget about, and that is the motivating powers for humans. Fear is one, and we've been trying to put the fear of hell into people with climate change, and it's not really working. Greed is another one, and that's been working in terms of market transformation. If I can now show this is my building is going to have more value. But then there is also the issue of love, which is a much more softer way of approaching it, but much more difficult. And then the last one is the whole issue of social sanction. That is how societies have organized and regulated themselves for thousands of years. Is that whole issue of social sanctions. If you don't perform in ways that is conducive to the improvement of society, you are put in exile. You are no longer invited to the tea party. And maybe that is the kind of thing that we need to start applying, is that the law of social sanction.
Okay, but let's get to the political realities here. Is someone going to run for mayor and say that? They're going to say that we're going to talk about social sanctions. I mean, aren't the priorities that a local official runs on public safety, education, economic development, and quality of life? where does sustainability and climate action really fit within those priorities?
Can I jump on that and actually try to answer it with regard to that next question that came in from the web as well? I mean, I think that issue of social sanction, I think, what is the most important action to get impacts fast? I think, given how incredibly bimodal this conversation is, I'm not going to be ambitious enough to sit on top of the whole thing, but one thing that is transparency and information about the consequences of action. What if we are articulating our goals, and a lot of these worst things happen in the dead of night. Not all the things that are bad happen in the dead of night. Some happen right in the open. But the issue of social sanction based on either shame or success. I mean, what is the consequence of this action for the goals and aspirations of the community? And if you don't have sufficient information to do that, that if you can't relate a decision to a consequence, we call it performance, do we call it whatever? I mean, when we talk about performance narrowly like energy, that's the easiest, most trivial case, and almost. But the issue of do you have in your community the transparency and information about the consequences of actions? And that is an incredibly broad statement, but if you don't have the basis for the social sanction about whether it was a good or a bad thing. So if that isn't in place, it should be. If it's not, you should work to make it in place. My 2 cents.
Marcelo?
Oh, what's the question?
I think I just rejected the premise.
Okay, let's move on then. Let's talk more about some of the political realities. Again, national governments are struggling to get through the financial crisis. They may not have the wherewithal at this point to take substantial action in both sustainable development or in climate action. Cities are also struggling financially. What are the steps that we can realistically expect between now and Rio+20 and say, this is what needs to happen? Or do we flip the argument and say, now with all these crises is the exact time that we should be focusing on these issues, and here's the reason why? So articulate the reason why.
Okay. Well, I think the next big step for the construction sector is integration actions. Why I am told about that? Because normally we talk about energy, they talk about water, the other ones talk about materials, but we do not integrate all these systems. And we can integrate water, materials, energy in buildings with urban spaces, to attend basic necessities of the community, to attend the comfort standards, to attend quality of life standards. And why I'm doing this? Because if we create a package of actions, we could bring in the financial system by one opportunity for them. The other action bring the users because, more comfort for me. The other action bring the government, votes for me. Or some opportunity that my city has to have an action in this direction, because it's important for the government say that they have much actions in climate change, sustainable developments, etc., etc. And other action could improve more efficiency of work, more efficiency to create wealth. And at this time, I would like to make to talk about a trade-off, because we need to reduce our consumption, but the works need to work. And how we make this transition, reduce the consumption without loss of works? This is a great challenge. I believe that we could move the consumption to the green economy. We need to give information and give space for new kind of jobs. New kind of jobs. Then we can move it. because today some kind of people, some part of society consumption a lot, and 2/3 consume it. 2/3 consume not enough, nothing for the basic needs. No, how we can do this? We need to change our industry and our marketing. But this takes time. We can move so fast, but we can program in 10 to 30 years this movement. I think it's this.
So I realized that I completely dodged your question to me on the
It's not the
politics.
first time it's
I have
happened.
it's not the first time in the last 20 minutes, but I'll build on that to say, I think that the reality there were other people in our organization sitting here, you get a slightly different answer, but from my perspective is that the near-term expectation, certainly from the United States, is that the solutions will not necessarily be coming from government. As sad as despite a history of things that, you know, the often attributed Churchill thing about us trying figuring out the right way after trying all possible bad ways. But in this case, I think we have worked ourselves into a corner where there is no realistic. The politics of this is that there is no governmental solution in the near term. I mean, the government's incapable of doing pretty much anything. So that actually, it sounds totally depressing, but that's it. So that
You're saying at the national level or at all
I
levels?
actually think that, well, so at the national level and and largely at the state and local level as well. And actually, I think that the one personal perspective on that is saying, if we believe that salvation is in the local, state and local government or in the municipal government, we have to be prepared for a level of heterogeneity of effect that we will actually really not like. In the sense of basically saying, are we prepared to have our neighbors and ourselves have vastly different levels of environmental and sustainability performance? Because that's what it actually means. And I find that pretty much intolerable. So anyway, so I think that actually, I don't mean that to be depressing, I just mean that to be actually the state of affairs on the ground. What I think it is a call to engage other mechanisms.
Okay, on that high note then, I want to give each of you a scenario. Your president or prime minister calls you in and says, I need two very specific actions that I need to take to Rio. Okay? They can be at the national level or they can be at the city level. Okay? Very specific actions that need to be taken. None of these vagaries. You've got 1 minute to answer. Karine, two specific actions.
Two specific actions. Change can only happen in cities, and only public sector can be the kickoff actor. And change has happened. Don't close your eyes from the fact that hundreds and thousands of cities have actually moved forward. I think that's a fact. But to the minister, remember the polluter pays principle. Establish in every city a department for pedestrians and cyclists, not only a transport department, and put high price on parking and cross-subsidize public transport. That's on mobility. And the other one is for any real estate investment, put very strict sustainability criteria, and for any money that the government is giving for let's say housing or any construction, put the sustainability criteria on the money.
Okay, so you're using fiscal instruments specifically as actions. Marcelo.
Well, first of all, I think it's provide the information and the education, to make people conscient. And the second one is align people. How we can align people toward the sustainable development. In Brazil, in 2000, we have a lack of energy. And the government said, if you don't save at least 20% of the energy that you spent last year, we will have a blackout, several blackouts in Brazil. And 2 months after, the Brazilian people are saving more than 20%, saving 25 to 30%. And this is a challenge for everyone in Brazil. we need to make my part of this kind of savings to do not have a lack of energy. This is the thing that we need to have, how to align people toward the same direction to sustainable development.
But as the Brazilian president, I need 2 specific actions that I'm going to take to Rio. Tell me what I should say. Yes.
What's the question?
2 specific actions that I can take with me to Rio.
I think we need to think in integration actions. This is very important because when we make a package, we create a contract between the old fashion and the new fashion. This is one link. And I think you need to use more the sustainable lifestyle, UNEP sustainable lifestyle to put art in this kind of business, to attract people to the new model of life and live.
Krishna, you've had the benefit of some time to think about your answer.
Well, my first response in my particular situation would be to tell the president to please resign and take your entire cabinet and the top layer of the civil service with you. Because they are actually keeping South Africa back from doing a number of really good things and wasting enormous amounts of money. Sorry, this is not on. Oh, there we go. So, good, that wasn't on the record. What I would say as a very direct action is to stop pussyfooting around renewable energy, scrap the plans for the coal-fired power stations that are in place, and start putting up concentrated solar thermal, anything solar, because we've got the best solar in the world in South Africa, and we're not harnessing it because we've got these entrenched invested interests in things like turbines for coal-fired power stations, in nuclear energy and so forth, which is part of why I said what I said in the first before I switched the microphone on. But I would say that is the key thing in South Africa, is to start doing it. We had our own power scares a couple of years ago, and it actually did quite a lot in terms of getting people to reduce their own consumption. But we're not really doing enough around putting things in place fast enough so that we can build that energy base to grow a green economy on in the country. And the second thing is, I would say, is put a 300% import tax on anything with a carbon footprint of more than 3 grams that comes into South Africa, except for things like books, of course, and essential things like medicines that we cannot manufacture ourselves. Because part of what is happening is that we are, because we have all these cheap imports from places like China, it's actually creating a culture of consumption in the country that wasn't there before.
Thank you. Dr. Payek?
All right, so I'm actually going to channel Marcelo for a second and say the first thing I would do is I'd recommend that they have a comprehensive program of transparency and disclosure with respect to the objectives of sustainable development, so that it is clear that if a product has 3 grams, then we have a product disclosure that has grams on it. Or if it is with regard to water, energy, human health, those endpoints of our policymaking must be immediately matched with transparency and disclosure so that it's clear what the choices mean. And I would apply that transparency and disclosure to, as a first step, ask them to commit to deliver for every new and renovated school, that school be above average, be better than the average of the stock, so that over time, everything through those disclosure processes is shown in operation to be better than the average of what came before. And over time, that'll make a difference. And once we're done while we're working on schools, we'll do affordable housing in neighborhoods too. But we'll start with schools, because if we can't agree on that, we're pretty sunk.
Okay. We have some microphones on the floor. Is there anyone from the floor who has a question for the panelists? No? Mr. Larson.
Do I need a mic? Or,
Krishna, the South African Vice President is in Helsinki today.
I'm using my time to muster my optimism.
There's another one here, another mic.
Okay,
There
now
you go.
it's working. Thank you. Yes, your lack of faith in municipal competence, I think that may be a fairly American viewpoint.
Let me clarify and the reason I feel that way is, so I've actually done a lot of work with and for municipal governments, and I actually think incredibly strongly of the benefits of things like ICLEI's approaches to climate action planning and those kinds of things that can make a difference. But the question was, what do I think that what is the real politic on the ground? And I think despite a huge, I totally agree that municipalities represent the best current option. But I actually think that if you look at it and you ask yourself, what does it mean? I'll take the U.S. case more narrowly. When a few dozen jurisdictions are so far out in front of so many others, what it does is contribute to the kind of heterogeneity in environmental benefits. It's not bad. It's a good thing. It's great. It is the embodiment of leadership. It is path breaking, but it is not the kind of solution that floats all boats. I hope it will be. I totally understand the concept, and I'm completely for it. But I think it is not. It's not the same as a comprehensive solution. It's something else. And so while I'm pessimistic about a national comprehensive solution, I mean, what we had back in the 60s with the National Environmental Policy Act, which led globally to a focus on disclosure and transparency and accountable decision making, is not the same thing as stitching together a bunch of very absolutely inspired local efforts. So anyway, again, I don't know if that gets to your point, but.
Yes, I think you also need a kind of base level of effort and support to ensure a minimum level of competence and resources available to municipalities.
Yeah.
And that's a very American problem at the moment.
Yeah.
And it may be a problem in Europe, parts of Europe tomorrow. But
Yeah.
Any other questions from the floor? Mr. Folliant, microphone, please, since you brought it up.
Okay, I'll just try to get a reaction. I'll try to address what you asked of them. Two things with the President, 1 minute, or Prime Minister. I would ask for a budget per person, per company, or per municipality of, say, a carbon budget, a target, performance-based. And so it's got to scale. There's lots of, I'll say, you announce a budget, and you scale them according to the size of economy or socio-demographic profile or things like that to make it targetable, a hard target. And then the second thing is to help them achieve that. So the first thing is the target, performance-based. Any way you can achieve that, you do it. Start with carbon because that's easier to measure with energy consumption and a few other things. And you can include water later on and other resources. The second thing is that if you, I will make it required to government buildings because that's under my authority or the authority of the buildings, whether that's a national or state. And then the second thing is then to say that if it's voluntary for 5 years in the market, then you're going to pay in a scaling thing if you're going to go over that budget. And it's a revenue neutral scheme because what you get out of there is offered to those who will devise solutions to meet those for their own operations in a matching grant, incentive rebate. So whether it's individual, households, or companies, we will match your effort to make those.
Okay, thank you, Greg.
Reaction.
So targets and associated financial incentives.
Correct.
Okay. We have about 2 minutes left. I'd like to ask each of the panelists within 30 seconds to talk about whether 20 years from now at Rio+40, whether we'll need to have a sustainable building conference to promote sustainable building, or whether we'll be to the point where we make things like this obsolete by making so much progress that it becomes common sense and the standard. Karine?
I think in Rio+40 we'll be talking about sustainable built environments, whatever the elements are. And I think we have progressed far beyond talking about carbon only. I'm sorry to say that, Dr. Foliente. I think it's misleading to focus only on carbon. We talk about inclusive cities and inclusive environments and inclusive work, and that those aspects have to be included.
I think in Rio+40, we are talking about to improve efficiency at the systems, but the big jump between the actual model of construction of urban space and the model of the Rio+40 will occur before. Then we are talking about improving, like not this year, a program, develop, act, and I think the jump will be before.
You're very optimistic to think there will be a Rio+40. If we think 2040, what is the predictions? The world will be about 3 to 4 degrees warmer if we continue the way we are now. Cheap fossil fuels would be a long and distant but very fond memory that only a few of our children will remember. The global economy would have seen some serious downturns because of climate change as well as fossil fuels. What that will do to global governance, whether we will still have the whole notion of an international getting together, whether the world will still operate or try to operate as a global level, or whether everything has gone down to a sort of localized level of decision making, we don't know yet. But we will definitely still be talking about sustainable buildings. What we will be talking about is how do we adapt the buildings that we've designed for performance standards that were accurate in 2000 will still be irrelevant. How are we going to fix all those buildings in a climate that is 4 degrees warmer and stronger winds that we're not thinking of now? So there's a lot of talk that will happen if we talk about retrofitting and fixing some of the problems that we've made in our limited time frame assumptions at the moment.
Okay. Now, Chris, going last, I'm sorry, but wait. In addition to that question, we've had a question that really summarizes this whole session come up. So in addition to the Rio+40, please address the question on the board. How can all the talk turn into some concrete action? And what will you do to contribute to the development of sustainable cities in the very near future?
Well, 30 seconds. All right,
Yes,
go.
sir.
I'm going to sound optimistic against that. Because, all right, for me, yes, we're going to be at Rio+40, but we're going to be, because green and sustainability is a continuum. However we are going to march down this continuum, and wherever practice is in 40 years, we're going to be asking to be better and better beyond that. It's a continuum. It's not a done endpoint. And from that, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of things that we talked about that were very concrete, and I'll just come back to the, I mean, the thing I was harping on. You know, what we do every day is try to provide more information, help people set goals, and then provide information about their achievement against those goals. For me, that is one of the most concrete actions you can go out today on any scale and take that action.
Final comments, Krishna.
Just to say about this, I think we underestimate how much action is already happening. If I think back about the Agenda 21 for sustainable construction in developing countries, we had a whole agenda at the back about actions that should be taken by stakeholders, by educational institutions by government. And I can now go back and I can make ticks behind each of those boxes in most of the countries that I've known of and that I know people working in there. So I think that there's a lot of action that has happened. What we fail to think is we're still trapped in this a reductionist mindset of thinking that we can get one magic silver bullet that's going to save the day. And the sooner we get rid of that illusion, the better for the future.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all of the panelists, and I would ask them. Yes, ma'am. If you'd go to the microphone, please. Very quickly. We're over time.
I am architect Neelam Manjunath from India, and since India is one of the emerging economies, that one question that you had asked about if the President or the Prime Minister asked you two things that you would like to do to take it to the next thing. The first thing that I mean, from my side, I would just think about all the government buildings across internationally. If we are able to say that you should be doing it as a proper example of sustainable buildings, because the government is the biggest builder anywhere in this world, in any country. So that probably would take care of a lot of things. And buildings are more than the largest polluters of energy, largest polluters on this earth. So probably that would take care of a very large sector of things that would taken care. And the second thing that I would talk about is eco-literacy. Eco-literacy programs, especially India, is probably one of the greenest country. It still is. And per person emission is still very low. But since we also, through this market economy and things like that, we are going towards consumerism, eco-literacy, especially in my country, probably would make people aware that they are actually the way they are living and the way they are doing things is already, quite good. And probably we could actually build on that. So it's from top down and from bottom up, we would be able to probably solve this problem. And that's what I feel.
Brings an education component to it. Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience, for your participation. I want to just thank the panelists again and offer them